Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Wright on the faculty at the Darla Moore School of Business, and I'm the director of our Center for Executive Succession. And it's a real great opportunity to talk to you today. As any academic, we always enjoy talking about our research and our thinking and the things that are going on academically. So today what I'd like to do is spend a little time talking to you about aligning strategy, culture, and talent. And just to give credit where credit is due, I'd say I've really been blessed over the course of my career to be surrounded by some really smart people that give me an opportunity to learn. And we'll talk about these three levers for success and how we align them. But just to give you a little bit of context, I owe my most of my knowledge about strategy to Jay Barney, who was on the faculty at Texas A&M with me a number of years ago. One of the most cited strategy authors in the world. I learned a lot about culture from working with Dave Ulrich, and Dave has really changed my thinking about how culture impacts organizations. I learned a lot about talent and really aligning talent from Scott Snell, who was one of my colleagues in the doctoral program at Michigan State, and then also on the faculty at Cornell for a number of years. And then last is this whole idea of aligning those three components comes from some conversations I've had with Kevin Cox. Now, Kevin was the CHRO at American Express about a month ago. He began the unenviable role of being the CHRO at GE. Great for GE, and I think Kevin is implementing a lot of these principles at GE to kind of hopefully see GE turn around from the kind of trouble it was back to becoming the iconic company that we all know it to be. So what we want to talk about today, these four questions to answer. One is, what is strategy? Another one is, what is culture? Another one is, what is talent? And this may sound very elementary, but the reason I want to talk about these is that often I find that we're using the same vocabulary, but we're often using very different dictionaries. So I want to come to some consensus on what I mean by strategy, what I mean by culture, and what I mean by talent. And then we can talk about, so how do we align all three of those to really create a competitive advantage in our organizations? So start, what is strategy? Now, this is the question that if we were face to face, I can guarantee everyone in the room would begin looking at their iPads or looking at their notes. Because generally, people think about strategy as kind of like, I think it was Justice Potter Stewart on the Supreme Court dealing with a pornography case said, well, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think that's the way a lot of people think about strategy is, I don't know that I can really offer a definition of strategy, but I know what strategy is. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to be more specific about what I mean by strategy and really the way that I think is the most useful framework for HR professionals to think about what strategy really means. And there's a long history behind the concept of strategy, but I think where we are today, the best way to view strategy is that strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions where all of those decisions are decisions about competition. And all of those decisions tend to fit into one of three generic questions. One is, where do we compete? Two is, how do we compete? And three is, with what do we compete? Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. When we talk about where do we compete, this is referred to as the domain choice within the strategy layer, the domain choice decision. What it means is we have to make decisions as an organization about in what product markets, in what geographies, in what industries are we going to compete? So when you see companies acquiring a new company to enter into a new industry, that's a where do we compete decision. When you see a company making a geographic expansion decision, that's a where do we compete question. I always love telling the story that a number of years ago, I was working with Nabisco International and facilitating a strategic planning retreat for them in Beijing, China. And I had the opportunity to have a drink with the general manager of the business, kind of the CEO of Nabisco International. And at the time, they had come out with a new product called an Air Crisp that was kind of like a potato chip but shaped like a Ritz cracker. And they also had a pretzel air crisp that was like a pretzel, but again, shaped like a Ritz cracker. And yet, if you were to go into a grocery store, you would find that those potato chip and pretzel products on the chip aisle. And I remember saying, like, why is it that you guys have your stuff on the wrong aisle? Because as a customer, if I wanted a potato chip or a pretzel, I would go down the chip aisle, not down the cracker aisle. And he looked at me and said, well, who owns the chip aisle? And I said, I don't really know. And he goes, Frito-Lay. And they have more money than God. And so if we try to get on the chip aisle, in essence, what they'll do is say, well, you like competition? Great, we can make crackers too. And he said, so our choice to be on the cracker aisle is a clear choice because we don't want to take on Frito-Lay as a competitor. So on a really micro scale, that was a where do we compete question. Second question is, how do we compete? And this is really, what is the value that we're going to offer customers that's going to make them want to buy from us instead of from our competitors? And if you go back to Michael Porter's original book, Competitive Strategy, he talked about 4 generic strategies being cost, differentiation, and focus. And then he had this 4th one that was stuck in the middle. And he said, that's not really a strategy. It's like trying to be cost and differentiation at the same time. So really, there's only 3 generic strategies: cost, differentiation, and focus. A few years later, he came out with a new book called Competitive Advantage. And he said, really, as I've worked with companies, I realized focus is simply being cost or differentiation within a particular product niche. So really, there's only 2 generic strategies, and that's cost and differentiation. And I don't know if you can see where I'm going with this, but really, there's only one how do we compete strategy, and that's differentiation. But it's trying to define how you're going to be different in a way that's going to make customers want to buy from you instead of your competitors, whether that's whether you're making a product or a service. It's that, why would customers buy from you instead of from your competitors? And then the with what do we compete? And this is really the reason that I think this is the best framework for HR people to think about, because the with what is essentially the what are the people, technology, and processes that we need in order to compete in these markets, delivering this value to our customers. And often what happens is that the people making these strategic decisions simply think, well, that's an execution question, and execution is the easy part. Now, actually, Ram Charan made a big amount of money by writing a book with Larry Bossidy called Execution, where their main premise of the book was actually the decisions are easy decisions. The hardest part for organizations, what drives their success, is the ability to execute. And so when we talk about it from an HR perspective, really the most important question that decision makers have to make is the with what. Do we actually have the capabilities in terms of people, technologies, and process to be able to compete in these markets and to deliver this valued customer outcome that's going to make customers want to buy from us instead of from our competitors? Now, with that as kind of a basic framework, there are 3 things or 3 requirements to have an effective strategy. One is that you are actually able to deliver those valued customer outcomes. It's one thing to say we're going to be the best at customer service. It's another to be actually able to deliver that. Again, this goes back to the with what. Do we have the capability to actually deliver that valued outcome to our customers in a way that's going to differentiate us from our competitors? The second requirement of strategy is that it requires making trade-offs. And that is that you have to focus on what you're going to be best at. And you can't be all things to all people. And that takes us into the third piece, and that is creating alignment. Do we actually, are we able to align all of our resources around creating that valued customer outcome? This is why Porter said stuck in the middle is not a strategy. He said, if you're trying to be cost and differentiation at the same time, someone's going to align all of their resources around cost and outcost you, and another competitor is going to align all of their resources around differentiation and out-differentiate you, and therefore you won't be best at anything. So as you think about the idea of strategy, what it requires is that we're aligning all of our resources around being best at delivering some valued customer outcome. So now that we've got strategy defined, the next question is, what is culture? And to help you define culture, what I'd like to do is a little bit of a thought experiment. And that is, first, I want you to think about what are some of the companies that you believe have strong cultures. The second question is, for each company, describe that culture. How do you know they've got a strong culture? And then third is, what aspect of the culture do you think is most important? So as we frame the culture discussion around those three questions, let me just give you some examples of companies that I think in the popular press, if you Google companies that are great for culture, here are some of the companies that'll show up. Now, I don't think anybody would disagree that all of these companies have some strong culture. They've been written about in the popular press as successful companies, and there's some aspect of their culture. Now, what aspect of the culture are they best known for? When we think about Zappos, it's really around service. That's really been the thing that's differentiated Zappos from all of the competitors within their industry, is that customers view them as being great at culture. If you look at REI, it's all about outdoors. Their internal culture is around outdoors. Their customers come into REI to buy outdoor things. So it's that outdoors component. Southwest Airlines, it's around service, but more importantly around fun. I think all of us would if you've ever flown a Southwest flight, you would describe it as clearly more fun than flying other airlines, even though they do the same in terms of getting you from place A to place B, and probably at a lower cost. But really what differentiates them is that fun environment they create on the plane. If we get to Chick-fil-A, clearly it's around service. I mean, anyone who's ever been to a Chick-fil-A just finds the friendliness of whoever it is that's taking your order, the way they serve you the food, the friendliness there. It's this service culture that Chick-fil-A has that kind of clearly differentiates them within the fast food industry. The chicken's pretty good as well. Adobe, it's all around this innovation and change. This is a company that continues to innovate, continues to change as their industry changes to stay ahead of all of their competitors. Samsung, again, is really around innovation. And while I have my Apple phone, and I think most people would view Apple as a premier company, if you look at a number of the kind of changes in phones, a lot of those have been driven by Samsung over the years. And Apple's been a quick copier on some of the things that Samsung offers. So while Apple is innovative, I think Samsung clearly is known as an innovative company. And then Johnson & Johnson, what they're known for is integrity with their customers. If you look at their credo, the four things that they view as being the priorities that drive their decisions, the number one thing is that they put their customers, the doctors, nurses, everyone who uses their products as their first priority. And then they get into their employees, they get into the society, and then to their shareholders, their stockholders. And they list those four things in that order, and they make very clear that the most important priority is the customers, the people that use their products. And the least important priority is their shareholders. And that those four components and the way they appear in the credo is actually a reflection of the ordering of the priorities at Johnson & Johnson. So if you think about that in terms of being some companies that have these great cultures, this explains why consultants are really getting into the culture space. And so you'll see all kinds of studies coming out that demonstrate the importance of culture, how companies that have great cultures are the most effective or the highest performing companies. Not that I disagree with any of these studies, clearly, but it's great to say that, but it kind of begs the question, right? Are all cultures good? And if you think the answer to that is yes, let's look at some companies that have not so great cultures. If you look at what happened to GE, again, an iconic company that over the last 5 or 6 years, we really noticed the outcomes of a shift in culture at GE playing out in poor performance over probably the last 2 to 3 years. But it was a cultural shift that began 5 and 6, 7 years ago at GE, where it became so insular, so internally focused about making the numbers that would make the street happy with them, as opposed to really focusing on their customers. If you look at Nike, they've faced all kinds of reputational problems over the last couple of years for what has come to be known as a rather sexist culture. In fact, one article in the Wall Street Journal described it as a boys' club, where women were passed over for promotions. They were put in environments that really didn't make them comfortable because of that boys' club nature. And then probably the one that is the most problematic of late is the Wells Fargo culture. It was really this results at all cost mentality, where their incentive system, their reward systems were all being driven, or all driving people to focus on results, to the point that they would do unethical things of creating new accounts for customers without customers' knowledge so that they could make their numbers, either because it would give them a pay raise or promotion or bonus, or because if they didn't make their numbers, they could be fired for that. Now, one of the things that I think is true today is that while the previous view of culture with all these successful companies is the way that HR professionals think about culture, I think the reality today is that these companies are the ones that boards of directors view as an example of culture, because boards of directors are really focused on the risk that comes with a culture that doesn't drive the right behaviors. So what is culture? Again, Edward Schein is probably the guru who was one of the first academics, who was very kind of an academic practice bridge person, that looked at culture. And he offered this definition in terms of kind of the assumptions about how the shared beliefs and values that people have, about how they solve their problems. I think this framework is probably an easier way to think about what he's saying in that definition. And that is, along the left side is the definition of these components. So we begin with the basic underlying assumptions. And these are these unconscious, taken for granted beliefs or perceptions, the thoughts and feelings that people have. The underlying assumptions drive the espoused values. And so this is the strategies, goals, philosophies, what it is that we kind of justify why we're trying to do these things. And then the artifacts are those visual things that we see in terms of organizational structures and processes. Well, on the right side is, what does that look like in organizations? How would you see culture manifest in an organization? Okay, and if you go down to the basic underlying assumptions, this would be the purpose statement, the mission statement, the beliefs about what's important and what's right in an organization. So again, if you think about where GE went wrong or where Wells Fargo has gone wrong over the last 5 or 6 years, is that culture began to kind of create this underlying assumption of arrogance or insularity, that we're the best, we don't need to look outside because we're better than everyone else. When you talk about the espoused values, I think we can all look at the values that an organization has stated in terms of innovation, service, teamwork, accountability. Now, these are those things that are on the wall that don't necessarily accurately describe what the true values of an organization are. I remember a number of years ago being called in at IBM to be part of the task force that was going to redefine their values. It was a line leader that was leading the task force, and I remember him opening the conversation by saying, if you look at the values that are over on the wall there right now, those really aren't the values that we live by at IBM anymore. And so our goal in this task force is to better define and describe the values that truly represent what IBM is today. Last is the reward systems, punishment, training, communications, all of those things. And I think the reward systems is probably the best example of what can be an indicator of culture and what can actually drive culture. So again, Wells Fargo, by creating bonuses and punishment for people that didn't make their results, or bonuses for people that did, that began to communicate something about what's important, the underlying assumptions about what's important and what's right. As Kevin Cox took over at GE, one of the things that he talked about was, he used to say it was just the strategy, culture, and talent that you had to integrate those three. And he said, one of the things that I've added to that is pay for performance. And he said the reason is that I can't figure out why it is that over the last X number of years, GE could have such miserable financial performance and yet see people become rich. Executives getting outstanding bonuses and stock option grants or stock grants. I mean, he said, so the reward system was driving this kind of culture at GE that it wasn't about, it was either about results or it was about the appearance of results as opposed to the actual results. So again, how attractive does this culture sound? Bruising, relentless, painful, frequent combat, burn and churn. Doesn't sound like a great culture, but if you know what this is about, this is actually a description of Amazon in a New York Times article that talked about the kind of terrible culture at Amazon. And this raises a question, is this a good or a bad culture? I actually had the privilege of visiting Amazon when it was probably about 4 or 5 years old. It was by then viewed as a very successful company. It wasn't a profitable company yet, but it was building a reputation for being an extremely innovative company that was changing. At the time, it was the book and music industry in particular. It was before they actually became more of a portal. But when I visited there were two kind of artifacts of the culture that I think described what the culture at Amazon was like. First was that when you walked into their greeting center, the table that the greeter was at was actually a door up on 2 sawhorses. And when you asked about that, what they said was, this really stems from Amazon being founded as a highly efficient organization. It was all about cost. Again, for them to be able to compete within the book industry and the music industry, they had to be able to offer lower prices than anyone else. So there was this constant focus on keeping costs as low as they could. And so they had this, they didn't go buy an expensive, beautiful desk for the greeter. They took a door and put it on 2 sawhorses and said, that's all we need for a desk. That's all that greeter needs. So this is one example of what that culture was like. The second was that as we wandered around the corporate headquarters, you would see people sleeping in conference rooms in the morning, in the middle of the day. And again, the people that were taking us around were saying, the culture at Amazon is, almost a 24/7 culture. And so some people don't even go home at night. They work all night because they're on a project, and then they'll just fall asleep in a conference room, catch a nap, and get back onto that project. Now, whether that's good or bad, what it illustrated was that this was a very hard driving culture. They were trying to change an industry. It was a culture where the mentality was whatever it takes for us to succeed, whatever it takes for us to change the nature of the retail industry, employees were willing to do. And so when you look at what happened at Amazon and what that culture looks like today, is that the culture is this relentless pursuit of innovating to serve customers. And guess what? Sometimes that's not great for people because it requires a bruising, hard driving, very difficult set of work processes that is inherent in the way Amazon was founded. This is a culture and a set of values that became embedded from the moment that Amazon started and has continued on as they've become wildly successful. But it's this excellence on behalf of the customer. So what that means is that there's not necessarily a good culture and a bad culture, but a right or a wrong culture, right? Depending on the needs of the business and what it is you're trying to succeed, and how that culture, and again, this is where I think Dave Ulrich has really influenced me, is how that culture is actually going to drive value for the customer. Last is what is talent. And again, what is talent? We all have different views of talent. I remember being at the Shell HR conference a number of years ago when they had just gotten a new head of talent, and somebody asked him, how are you defining talent? And he said, I don't have a definition yet, but when I do, I guarantee that definition will make it possible for any individual employee at Shell to be considered talent. So this is this broad view of anybody that can make a significant contribution to the company. Another way a lot of companies, I think, define talent is based on leadership. And it's, that high level in the organization, the people that are making the key decisions for the organization, and the high potentials that have the potential to be the future decision-making leaders in the organization. Well, I think that the best way for us to talk about talent today is impact-based. And it's really, who are the people that drive a disproportionate level of value for the customers? And what does that look like? Well, to understand what that impact-based definition of culture looks like, it's starting with a core capability. And that is, the core capability has to define what is the value that it's going to offer for company or for their customers. And then what's the capability that they have to deliver that value. And so once you've defined the value, you can kind of move back and looking in your organization as where in the organization is that value created for the customer. So think about that Starbucks. What are some of the capabilities at Starbucks that have made them successful? We can say there's, within their value chain, there's the sourcing and supply chain management, their connections with their coffee growers. In fact, at the time that I was doing a lot of work with Starbucks and fair trade was becoming a big deal, they said that their sourcing, they bought so much coffee around the globe that if they were to only buy fair trade coffee, they would have cornered the market on fair trade coffee. So it's this relationship with their growers and how they manage the supply chains. Coffee operations, again, anybody that's had Starbucks coffee knows that where they distinguished themselves was this dark roasted coffee that had a very different taste from what most of us were used to. And that all came from the roasting and blending process. Customer management, going into the Starbucks and getting your Starbucks, and then the regulatory environment. So these are kind of the 4 core capabilities that Starbucks has been able to develop to deliver value to their customers. So how do you identify talent? Well, once you understand those kind of components to the value chain and the capabilities, the key to identifying talent is to understand who are the critical employee groups that drive success. Lucian Alzari, who's the chief HR officer at Prudential, he'll often say that the most important thing that you have to do in defining talent is to know where you have to have world-class talent versus where good is good enough. So when we talk about these critical employee groups, what we're saying is, where do you have to have first-class or world-class talent? In those other categories, it's employee groups. It's not that you want bad people, but where is good enough? So if you look at Starbucks, coffee traders and the sourcing and supply chain management are the key employee group that drives value there. If you look at coffee operations, it's the coffee master, the roaster that are the key employee groups there. In customer management, it's the barista and the floater. And again, because what they're trying to do at Starbucks is create this operational excellence that you can go in and get a good cup of coffee, but get it quickly. What does the floater do? Well, the floater is a person who, when you're in Starbucks and you see, you place your order, you see your barista making it, and you'll see a bunch of bodies back there. The floater's job is to identify where in the process is the biggest bottleneck at any point in time and jumping to that point in the process. So if the process is being bogged down by taking the order, then they jump on a cash register and start taking an order. Once they get the line down, they might jump into a barista role and start making the coffee. If it's not at the making of the coffee, it's serving it, then they'll jump into the calling out the names and handing the coffee out to people. So that floater is moving around to know what is important. All right, so that's the key employee group. Once you know the key employee group, you've got to manage that talent. And managing the talent says, what are the competencies and the deliverables we want from that employee group? Again, you've got these examples of what each employee group needs in terms of competencies and deliverables. And then how do you manage them? What's the HR system have to look like to build those competencies and get those different deliverables? So this is the idea of managing talent in a way that identifies who's critical to creating value for customers. So back to the beginning, we've got these 3 components: strategy, culture, and talent. How do you actually align those? And this is the important question. What is it they're aligned around? Again, Kevin Cox talked about this early on, and I never knew what he meant about, we have to have those aligned, but how do you align them? Well, guess what? We've been talking about it. It's all around customer value. What do I mean by that? Strategy. Strategy is defining customer value. What is the valued outcome that you're going to offer to your customers that's going to make them want to buy your service or your product instead of competitors? Culture. It's how does the cultural values in the organization translate into delivering value to the customers? If you're Zappos, if your valued outcome is service one of your cultural values that actually drives value for customers? And again, a Dave Ulrich quote, he says, a cultural value only matters as much as it creates value for customers. And then talent. Defining talent based on the people who drive customer value. So if you say, how do we create alignment between these three components? The idea is it's all around customer value. Having a strategy that defines the value, a culture that creates alignment around people towards delivering that customer value, and talent where we're world-class in the employee groups that actually create that customer value. So my conclusion is good organizations have a good strategy, they have a good culture, and they have good talent. But great organizations are the ones that create alignment among strategy, culture, and talent. And that alignment is around customer value. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about some of my thinking, and I wish you the best in your careers. Thanks very much.